few people have asked me to talk about the Gauley Bridge. Apparently this has been one of your assignments recently. Suddenly I've become very famous. Participation in the Gauley Bridge affair. That was in the early 1930s, and I guess what led to my fame was being asked to testify at a congressional hearing on this whole business. And so my remarks got into the congressional record. Those you can read about, but what you can't read about is some of the sidelines, sidelights to this thing. How I got into it was that there was a congressman, Vito Marcantonio, who represented East Harlem in New York. And he was a diabetic, and he was a patient of one of my friends who was an internist who treated diabetes and other things like that. And this was Norman Jolliffe, who developed sort of reputation. He did a lot of publication on nutrition and particularly on alcoholism. At any rate, Norman, Marcantonio knew that Jolliffe was at Bellevue, and there were a lot of doctors around Bellevue. Couldn't he find one who knew something about silicosis or chest diseases who would go and testify? And I thought this was a great opportunity for me, and the reason I thought it was a great opportunity for me was that I had an old girlfriend who was living in Washington. I thought here was a good chance for me to go to Washington. This young lady. So I went. And I thought, well, I'm a teacher now. I have to do a proper job. So I went over to the Pathology Museum in Bellevue and found a lung with chronic fibrotic disease in it. I'm not sure it was called silicosis or not, but it served a purpose. So it was in a great, huge jar and full of formalin. And so I said, well, I've got to show these people what a silicotic lung looks like. So I towed it off to Washington with my jar in my hand, and turned up in the hearing room, and I had this, I think I had in a brown paper bag or something. So when I got into the room, I set it down on the hearing table. Well, two people, you could still smell the, came around, looked at it, and sort of backed off, and then finally, everybody was giving me quite a clear berth there. And finally I said, well, now they asked me to explain what is this disease and what can it do. And I said, well, here's the best way is to show you. And so I opened the jar and took out the lung, at which point everybody left the room. So I was talking to the stenographer for most of the time there. So I said, this is the sort of thing that the motivation, of course, very important, and the result equally important, but of course it got into the congressional record. Now, I recall other things about it which I think come through in the hearing. I haven't read it for some time, but obviously this was the most scandalous and reprehensible situation. It's really a horror story of the nth degree. And I think this probably comes through in the record, how the contractors had brought a lot of labor up from the south and considered them pretty much expendable. They knew they were going to be drilling through this mountain, and this is where Margaret comes from that part of the world. I found her drilling. No,
I'm reincarnated.
At any rate, this was, I think, 90% pure silica rock that they were drilling through. And it seems that they had been advised, the contractor had been advised, that silicosis is something which takes 10 years at least to develop. That was the current understanding of it. And they figured they could finish this job in 2 years, or at most 2.5 years, and be out of there. And by that time, nobody would get silicosis, and the job would be done, they'd be gone, and that was it. But they didn't realize that this created what was up to that time an unknown situation of the severity of the exposure and the high free silica content of the rock had just never been equaled anywhere. And so the syndrome of acute silicosis first became apparent in this particular situation. And of course it was diagnosed as pneumonia, and a lot of these people died. And maybe the doctors thought it was pneumonia, but I think somebody had an idea that it might have been something else. At any rate, the people who died and became incapacitated, I think, got a pretty raw deal all the way through. I think this was clear. Anna, do you have some recollections about this? Or
I remember how shocked we were.
Yeah, it was a truly shocking thing. I think didn't Alice Hamilton testify in these hearings? Is her name in there anywhere?
No.
Because she was still around, going strong in the 30s, wasn't she?
Oh, yes.
How did we first hear about it?
Through Congressman Mark Antonio. See, he was a member of the Labor Committee. I don't know how he first heard about it. Maybe some union people or somebody called it to his attention. The unions weren't in very good shape. This was Depression times, and anybody could get any kind of a job. It was great to have it. At any rate, that's the goal. That's the goal. Does anybody have any specific questions about it that I haven't covered?
I was wondering, was this a general public sort of thing? I mean, was it something that hit the newspapers with a splash and,
oh, yes,
and really caught a lot of public attention?
It was in the news media, yes. Of course, we didn't have TV in those days, or else it would have been around a lot more. But it was in the newspapers. But I guess people weren't paying much attention to that sort of thing. People were interested in survival altogether in the 1930s, and it's too bad. Either you work and you get killed from your job, or you don't work and you starve. It was this sort of thing. So the whole atmosphere was very, very different. And I suppose the TV has been a big item in making these changes, where you get instant everything all over the world. But it wasn't suppressed. I mean, it wasn't hushed up or anything like that.
Oh, no, it was all over the papers.
Yeah, it was all over the papers.
We all knew about it.